This lecture is on tab 6, which is chapter 14, the informative speech. So this chapter is the nuts and bolts and everything that goes into writing and giving a strong informative speech. After I complete this lecture, you will have a quiz, and then you can go ahead and start working on preparing, writing, researching your informative speech. So first of all, there are 4 types of informative speeches that most people who are giving an informative speech choose to use. A speech to describe, a speech to instruct, a speech to explain, and a speech to report. For the informative speech that you will be giving in this class, you will actually be able to give almost any of these. But most commonly, it will probably be a speech to describe, a speech to explain, and maybe a speech to report. I doubt anybody's going to do a speech to instruct, but if you're able to craft a speech within the speech parameters for that, feel free to give it a go. So how to choose your information topic. Get to know the audience and situation, which we've covered in an earlier chapter. Same idea with creating an idea bank. Select and narrow your informative topic. Identify your specific purpose. Confirm that based off of your purpose and your topic that you are choosing the best type of informative speech. Then with that, you're going to go ahead and identify your central idea and create a working outline. A lot of these things have already been covered in earlier chapters and earlier lectures, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. But the most important thing here is you're going to want to make sure that you pick a topic that you are interested in, that you can research, that you can find other information, and that you can find outside information for citational and just evidentiary support. And then you are also going to want to make sure that you pick a topic that you are interested in, so that way that is shown through your speech. So the next step is to go ahead and research information for your informative speech. So you want to construct a good, and so you want to make sure that you are taking all of the things from tab 3 or from tab 2 when we talked about how to research and having good support. You want to make sure you're keeping all of those things in mind when you are researching your informative speech. Once you have your information collected that you have from your own brain and from your outside sources, the next thing to do is going to be to construct an informative outline. So your informative outline, you are going to see a good example of that on page 313. It shows you an example. I will also be posting an example of an informative outline. So my informational speech that I am posting is on Juilliard College. That is just a speech I gave a while ago when I was told to pick a college that I would consider attending. I was considering at that point in time attending Juilliard College, so I wrote an informative speech about that college. The parameters of your speech are going to be a little bit different. I'm going to ask for you to write an informative speech about an aspect of technology, which is a really broad topic, but it gives you lots of options. So you could pick an up-and-coming gadget. You could talk about something that already exists. You could talk about a social media platform. The options out there are pretty open. So I'm just going to be asking you to give an informative speech about something that has to do with technology. So that will give you plenty of areas to research, and the book will teach you, and my example will show you how to go about creating an informational outline. So how do you go about organizing informative speech? So the first thing you want to do is recognize your organizational strategy. Are you going to go chronological? Are you going to go spatial? Are you going to go cause and effect? Probably won't be the best because that's more for persuasive speeches. But remember in chapter 3 when we went over creating and outlining your speech, you want to make sure you pick a good strategy. Then you want to construct your main points. So once you have your central idea, your general purpose, which is to inform, your specific purpose, your topic, and your central idea, once you have all of those considered, then you want to come up with what your 3 main points are going to be. Once you have those set in place, that's going to help you know what research that you're going to need to conduct, what support materials you are looking for. And then your support materials will be supporting your main points, which will be supporting your central idea. So a few things to keep in mind when you are presenting an informative speech. With a topic like technology, you need to be very, very careful about language. You got to make sure that you don't get too much into jargon that the audience is not going to be able to follow what your speech is on. So your informative speech, you got to make sure you're using language that everybody's going to be able to understand. With your delivery, you're going to also want to make sure that you are conversational in informative speeches. The major struggle a lot of people have with informative speeches is that the information is very dry. It's not given with a lot of emotional investment. So I'm not saying to go over the top and fake and weirdly with it, but to make sure that you use stories and you use anecdotes and things along those lines to break up just giving information. So try to avoid, I call it, don't get listy, is what I try to say. So what I mean by that is try to avoid doing an in-depth description where you break everything down, where you spend 2 minutes just talking about the different parts of a piece of technology. Instead, focus on 1 or 2 or 3 of those parts and go more into detail about those, their purposes, stories about how they came about, however you want to do it. But the more stories or the more information you can do outside of just providing a list or just providing statistic after statistic after statistic, the stronger your speech is going to be. So try to avoid just being dependent on statistics and lists from outside sources. Make sure that you are providing plenty of information that you already have that you didn't have to get from an outside source. So when you're picking your topic, make sure that you are keeping that in mind. You should pick something that you're already slightly familiar with. Presentational aids aren't going to be an aspect of this speech because I'm not requiring presentational aids for your informative speech. So if you are listening to an informative speech, you want to make sure that you are listening effectively, that you're evaluating both the message of the speech and the presentation of the speech. So in a nutshell, I just want to make sure that you are aware of what an informative speech is. So we don't really talk about it too much in this chapter, but it's something that I do want to stress. It is tricky for a person to give an informative speech because we are inclined as human beings to be persuasive. So an informative speech is strictly giving information. It's not saying that something is better than another. It's not saying that something is too expensive or too cheap. It is literally providing information. So you have to be very, very careful that the support you have and the things you are saying are not trying to convince the audience that they should pick something over something else. So a perfect example is if you wanted to do a compare and contrast informative speech that compares Microsoft to Apple, you can do that. But what you have to do is be very, very careful that you're not leaning towards telling people that Apple is better than Microsoft or vice versa. If you're giving a speech about Google Glasses, that's great, but you have to make sure that you're not hailing the Google Glasses as the greatest thing since sliced bread, but instead sharing with us what Google Glasses are and how they work. So you have to be careful with your word choices and careful with your delivery that you are giving us information without trying to convince us of anything. So when you get your informative outline completed, if you want me to take a look at it, let me know. I will be more than happy to take a look at it and let you know if it's a truly informative speech or if you have some persuasive things going on within it. So keeping all those things in mind, this brings Chapter 14, which is Tab 6, to an end. So please feel free to take the Tab 6 quiz, and the next step in our speech class is going to be getting that informative speech down. So make sure that you are reading the rubric and that you are understanding how citations are going to work, both oral citations within your speech and written citations, which are going to be on the last page of your outline. I am going to be requiring citations for this speech, so get practicing those. Also note that when I was talking about the note cards earlier, you are allowed to have your citations written out word for word on your note cards, because I don't expect anybody to memorize on October 16th, 2014, on the webpage, Yay Speeches, Joe Smith stated that public speaking is becoming something people are doing more and more often. That is a completely made up citation. But if you're using an exact citation and we don't want to misquote anybody and we don't want to mess up the citational information, which will then end up being plagiarism, I allow and recommend that citations be written out word for word. So I will go over all of that in my informative speech video that I will be doing here shortly. It will include what the note card should look like with the citations written out. I will have all of that, and I will be providing an example informative speech for you. So keep an eye out for that. That should be up here shortly. And good luck on this quiz, and more importantly, good luck with your informative speeches.